There were no screams, only the muffled sound of flesh being sliced. Before death came silence, imposed by force, stitched with pain, because no lover of the king could claim victory without first losing her voice. They said she didn't kill out of rage, but out of strategy. A queen surrounded by beauty, espionage, and desire, who chose to make her rivals' tongues the first offering. And in that palace, punishment was as refined as the perfumes, and far more lethal. And if you, like me, enjoy true stories that challenge what the books tell us, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters. And tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them. Born far from the capital, daughter of a disgraced concubine and a vanished diplomat, she was given to the palace as a child. She grew up among embroidered rugs and silent spies, learning that beauty opened doors. But poison locked them. Her real name was erased from the records. What remained was a title, Valide Sultan. Inside the harem, her rise was like a dance on blades. Every move calculated, every glance deliberate. She was beautiful, but never naive. Her gaze didn't ask for permission, it commanded. And when she became the Sultan's chief wife, she inherited more than power. She inherited the eyes of every woman who wanted to see her fall. She knew, in that place, love was only a disguise for war. From the moment they passed through the gilded iron gates, the women of the harem weren't entering a sanctuary, but an unnamed war. Officially, they were protected, fed, educated. But behind velvet curtains and locked windows was a world built on mistrust, ambition, and strategic silence. The Sultan's harem wasn't a luxury brothel, as many Western accounts suggested. It was a hidden political system where each woman represented an alliance, a threat, or a potential inheritance. Some came from distant noble families, offered as diplomatic gifts. Others were orphans, enslaved as children, and molded into instruments of power. All of them, without exception, learned early on that a poorly aimed smile could cost them their lives. In that enclosed environment, words were weapons. A whisper could ruin a rival's reputation. And closeness to the Sultan was more than romance, it was survival. The woman who bore the first male child gained privileges. But that also made her a target. It was in this space of constant tension that the queen emerged. She didn't just survive the games of the harem, she reinvented them. She understood that to keep control, she had to do more than patrol the halls. She had to mutilate the voices, literally. That's why the Sultan's lovers weren't simply removed, they were silenced, one by one. The 17th century Ottoman harem was comparable to a sealed battlefield. No blood on the walls, but blood in the eyes. And when fear is no longer enough, what remains is terror. The queen knew that. That's why she ordered the tongues to be torn out, because as long as someone could still speak, danger remained. This practice, never officially documented, but described in private letters, travelers' diaries, and popular songs, was never acknowledged by the palace. But the silenced bodies spoke for themselves, and the very absence of official records on these punishments is a record in itself. The harem wasn't just a physical space, it was a hidden war zone, where the prize wasn't territory but endurance, where the throne wasn't made of gold but porcelain, fragile, beautiful, and dangerous. And there, at the heart of the empire, silence was the final sentence. That night's banquet was smaller than usual. Only the main musicians, a few trays of fruit and a new perfume in the air. Too sweet, as if trying to mask something. In the center of the hall, among pillows and colorful veils, a young woman danced with lowered eyes and precise gestures, trained to captivate without appearing disrespectful. She was new, but the Sultan had already noticed her. The queen, seated to the left of the throne, said nothing. She simply watched every movement of the girl, every breath of her husband, and above all, the moment that changed everything, the exact second he smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, nor one of artistic admiration, but a warm, lingering smile, one that lasted longer than it should have, a smile of future memory. That night no one in the harem slept. The queen didn't either, and for the first time in years of absolute rule, she felt what many inside those walls felt: insecurity. But the difference was that for her, fear wasn't paralyzing. It was fuel. For years, she had been the only one with unrestricted access to the royal chambers, the only one whose opinion influenced the inner council. But now, a simple dancer threatened her position, not by intelligence, not by strategy, but by youth, and to a woman shaped by the politics of the harem, that was an unforgivable insult. The Sultan didn't notice, not at that moment. He slept peacefully that night. But she had already made her decision. That girl could not stay, not because she was dangerous, but because she reminded the Sultan that there were other possibilities. And in the Queen's world, possibility was betrayal. The next day, the new dancer didn't appear in the garden as usual. The maids said she was sick, but no one else saw her again. Neither alive nor dead, only rumors. That was the turning point. Not a coup, not a scandal, but a look, a smile, and the birth of a silent fracture between love and power. From then on, the Queen no longer saw rivals. She saw threats. And with threats, she didn't negotiate. She eliminated. This transformation went unnoticed by the court, but it was clear to those who served closely. The Queen stopped protecting the harem and began ruling it through fear, because for her, the only way to guarantee silence was to rip the words out at the root. The night she lost the Sultan's favor was also the night she lost any trace of affection. That was the moment the woman behind the legend was born, not the chosen wife anymore, but the queen who commanded silence. Literally. It happened on a stifling morning, before the sun had even warmed the marble tiles of the harem. The servant assigned to bring incense to the bath chamber came back running, trembling, her eyes wide with horror. No words were needed. She simply pointed. The others understood. The body was there, still dressed in the silk robes from the previous night. No signs of struggle, no scratches on the face, no bruises on the arms. Only one thing was out of place: the mouth. Or rather, what was left of it. There was no tongue, only the empty, fleshy, dry space, like speech itself had been torn out by the root, with precision, with method, with cold rage. There was no way to hide it. The maids exchanged fearful glances, but no one dared say the victim's name. The order was clear: silence. And anyone who broke that invisible pact could suffer the same fate. The young dancer's death was never officially declared. They said she had been sent to another palace as a diplomatic gift, a lie repeated so often that even the Sultan, or at least his conscience, pretended to believe it. But inside the harem, everyone knew. The first warning had been delivered. The torn-out tongue wasn't just punishment, it was a signature. That day, the Queen didn't appear in the gardens. She stayed in her quarters, surrounded by 3 of her oldest attendants. It said she drank clove tea, as she usually did, to calm her nerves. But what stood out most was the silence. She didn't smile, she didn't speak. She simply observed their reactions, measured the glances, like someone planting fear and waiting to see where it would take root. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread through the inner corridors. The younger concubines began moving in groups. The older ones remained completely silent, and all of them started avoiding the Sultan's compliments, because there, a smile could be a sentence. A lingering gaze could be a ticket to oblivion. The first tongue cut wasn't an act of madness, it was strategy, a symbolic gesture of control, a way to say, "Here, only I may speak, and anyone who tries to replace me doesn't even deserve the right to beg for mercy." And the most frightening part is, it worked. No other death was officially recorded that year, but several women simply disappeared. Some were said to have married foreign nobles, others moved to distant palaces, and others Well, not even their names remained in the records. From that point on, the harem was no longer just a place of rivalry. It became a prison without bars, where the sound of laughter could be mistaken for defiance, and where, more than ever, silence meant survival. Because once the queen realized that love could be lost, she decided she would never again lose power. There was a man in the palace whom everyone feared, but no one dared to hate. He didn't carry weapons, didn't give orders. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He wore white, his cuffs always clean, his eyes lowered, and a faint scent of camphor followed him wherever he went. His name was rarely spoken aloud, but everyone knew him as the Sultan's surgeon. He wasn't part of the harem, nor of the royal council. His position was ambiguous, close enough to power to never be ignored, distant enough that his actions wouldn't stain anyone's name but his own. But he answered to the queen. She was the one who sent him folded notes, sealed with gold wax. And for her, he walked silently through the suffocating corridors of the women's wing. They said he had studied medicine in Persia and had learned more about the human body than any other man alive in the empire. But the knowledge that made him indispensable wasn't about healing, it was about cutting. He knew exactly where to cut without killing. He knew how to silence a mouth without taking breath. He knew how to turn a tongue, the organ of speech, seduction and betrayal, into dust and oblivion. The victims weren't dragged by force. They were led as if about to receive a gift. Tea served beforehand, a room lit by scented candles, and the soft touch of a hand in fine gloves. The procedure was quick, but never painless. First, the restraint, then the iron hook fastened to the cheeks, and finally, the removal. No anesthesia, no mercy, no chance to beg. This was what the queen called purification, a clean name for an unclean act, a ritual that left no mark on the face, only inside where words once lived. She believed that enforced silence lasted longer than death, that a woman without a tongue could no longer seduce, conspire, or lie, and the surgeon with his cold hands and guiltless eyes was the perfect cog in that machine of fear. No one ever saw him raise his voice, nor show remorse. Perhaps he believed he was simply following orders. Or perhaps he saw his role as part of a greater justice, an internal cleansing, a surgery on the soul of the harem. What is known is that after the third victim, no concubine smiled in the queen's presence again, and no maid dared repeat the sultan's compliments in the halls. Fear was no longer just psychological, it was anatomical. The palace, once filled with female voices, songs, and muffled laughter, began to breathe in silence, as if every wall had learned how to hush. And at the center of that silence was him, the man who wasn't an executioner, but turned the scalpel into an instrument of absolute power. Over time, the harem ceased to be merely a garden of imperial delights and became a labyrinth of surveillance. The women who wandered among the embroidered tapestries and perfumed baths no longer spoke from vanity, but from caution. What once was a contest for attention turned into a cold war, where a misunderstood glance could seal someone's fate. Not all who disappeared had actually lain with the Sultan. Some never touched him, others never even desired to. But in a place where intimacy was currency, knowing too much was a greater risk than loving. It was enough to hear what shouldn't be heard, enough to suspect what couldn't be proven, enough to not fall silent fast enough. One of them, according to reports erased by anonymous scribes, was the daughter of an enemy diplomat. She arrived as a political offering, but observed more than she smiled. It was believed she knew details of a poisoning plot in the royal corridors. When she mentioned it to the wrong person, her name was sealed. She disappeared the next morning, the sheets still warm. The maid found only one earring on the floor and a drop of blood on the prayer cushion. Another, informally called the scribe, had never been touched by the Sultan, but she could read, and she had translated, by mistake or out of curiosity, a letter intercepted between two of the Queen's allies. She told no one, but hesitated when greeting the sovereign. And in that world, hesitation was confession. She was taken to the Garden of Silence, as the courtyard was known, where women were summoned without warning, and she was never seen again. It wasn't desire that condemned, it was usefulness. The queen knew the harem was a fortress where any lover could become an informant, any spy could hide behind veils, and any smile could be a blade. She didn't see herself as cruel, but as a strategist. A betrayed heart may bleed, but a threatened throne must act. And to her the greatest poison was a loose word, because a word was memory, it was evidence, it was a weapon. Some cried, others begged. Many didn't even know why. But in the queen's eyes, all of them represented something greater than they seemed, because in a system built on silence, any sound was the noise of rebellion. And so, among golden tapestries and muffled whispers, the harem became a theatre, where the actresses could be queens, accomplices, or corpses, depending only on who controlled the script. In the end, what the queen sought wasn't the sultan's exclusive love. It was the monopoly on loyalty. And to maintain that empire of shadows, no voice could survive, not even those who had said nothing, yet. The stories of the harem weren't written, they were stitched, line by line, gesture by gesture, in the hands of women who knew too much and survived because they knew how to appear invisible. They were called the harem's seamstresses, but they did much more than sew dresses. They were the first to see the signs of punishment, and the last to comment. Because there, silence wasn't just safety, it was survival. Every morning, piles of used fabrics were left in discreet rooms of the palace. Among silks, sheets, and veils were items that revealed what decrees dared not name: a torn scarf, a stained cloth, a dancer's tunic with no collar, as if ripped off in haste. The seamstresses asked no questions, they only washed, mended, and forgot. But there were days when not even royal perfumes could cover it. The garments came in stiff, cold, dampened with something that didn't evaporate. And on those days, the whispers in the harem ceased completely. Every woman knew someone else had disappeared, and that stitching in that palace wasn't just for beauty, but to erase traces. One of them, older, was named Fatma. She had been mute since childhood, which made her ideal for the job. They said she understood everything, even without hearing a word. She was the first to notice a pattern. The scentless clothes always belonged to women who weeks earlier had been seen near the queen's private balcony. Some carried trays, others notes. All of them eventually vanished without leaving perfume in their fabrics. Fatma once sewed the same scarf 3 times. With each patch the stain seemed larger. The last time she buried it in the harem's herb garden, not out of rebellion, but out of fear. She knew some threads carried memories, and that some memories, if burned, returned in the form of nightmares. The other servants followed her example. They began to identify the fabrics not by their scent, but by the silence that came with them. They learned not to look the queen in the eye when she passed, not out of disrespect but instinct, because those eyes weren't looking for beauty. They were searching for confession. It was as if the very air inside the harem had been stitched by them, tight, suffocating with invisible seams of fear and obedience. Each pulled thread carried an untold story, and each hurried patch hid a sentence carried out with no witnesses. In the end, the seamstresses weren't accomplices. They were mirrors, mirrors of a regime where even blood had to be folded, washed, hidden, and delivered as if it were just another piece of fabric. And while the Sultan slept among perfumed cushions, the true seat of order was wherever the blood dried, and where no woman dared ask whose it was. In the inner halls of the harem, where a whisper was worth more than an imperial seal, no written orders were needed. A poorly placed word, a gesture at the wrong time, and a woman's fate was sealed. What the law didn't recognize, fear understood perfectly. The queen rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her power didn't come from decrees, but from glances, and her glances, when too fixed, killed before the punishment even began. A murmur was enough, a misplaced phrase during ceremonial tea, a slight lift of her eyebrow when a concubine's name was mentioned, and the harem understood a sentence was underway. The most feared phrase wasn't shouted. It was whispered like poison. "She sings too much." And all the eunuchs knew what it meant. It wasn't about music. It was about words, about rumors, about a woman who dared to say too much, seduce more than allowed, or worse still, carry secrets that could leak beyond the golden walls. When the sentence was spoken, the protocol followed with ritualistic precision. The woman in question was summoned for private services in the Queen's chambers. She arrived wearing her finest garments. She left never again. Her name was removed from the servants' rotation. Her belongings silently redistributed. No ceremony, no body, just silence and a new stain in the harem's corridors. It wasn't justice, it was purification, said the Queen, and there was no trial, because in the harem, justice was whatever she decided it to be. There were no lawyers, no pleas, just the ritual of disappearance. Once, one of the oldest eunuchs, Mehmet, responsible for guarding the harem's entrances, dared to hesitate before the unspoken command. "Majesty." Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, he ventured to say. The next day, a new concubine was taken to the western wing. Mehmet never spoke again. The harem walls absorbed everything. Fear, muffled crying, the dragging of damp cloths on the floor, the silence of those who remained. Every unwritten sentence was like an invisible cut in the court's fabric, and the more invisible, the more effective. Some of the Sultan's advisors suspected, but they never questioned. The Queen was untouchable, and the harem was her domain. Everything that happened there remained between curtains and veils, and while the world celebrated alliances and military victories, inside the palace, the real tribunal was presided over by eyes lined with kohl and hands that never stained with blood. But the blood was there, on the sheets, in the corridors, in the gaze of the survivors. It was a judgment with no judge, no defense, and only one witness: fear itself. There were two kingdoms inside the palace, the one he ruled and the one she controlled. The Sultan was seen on the terraces, in war councils, in meetings with ambassadors, but he never, ever ventured into the labyrinthine paths of the harem. It wasn't out of ignorance, it was by choice. The rumors reached him, of course. No monarch, no matter how isolated, is completely blind to his own walls. One of the advisors murmured about the interrupted dance of a concubine, about rosewater-soaked handkerchiefs that concealed blood, about the growing silence among the younger women of the harem. The Sultan frowned, sipped his wine, and said, "Internal affairs of the harem are handled by the Queen." It was an expected response, diplomatic, cold, but also revealing, because deep down, the Sultan knew. He knew that such absolute silence wasn't natural, that the sudden absence of certain concubines wasn't illness or exile. He knew and chose not to know more. During one of his nighttime walks through the inner gardens, he came across a young concubine crying silently. He looked at her, extended his hand, but before he could speak, the girl pulled away with a fear that wasn't of him, but of her, of the woman who watched her steps even in absence. That night the Sultan didn't sleep, but he also didn't act. Omission became the foundation of impunity. While he signed treaties, she stitched silence. While he planned military campaigns, she eliminated internal threats. And while he celebrated victories in the public square, the harem floors were washed 3 times a day, not for cleanliness, but so that no trace of blood would survive the morning light. Some modern scholars argue that the Sultan was a prisoner of his own queen, that after consolidating power and bearing an heir, she became untouchable, the true force within the harem and at times beyond it. Other historians say he consented out of convenience, As long as she kept the harem in order, he didn't have to worry about internal defiance. But there's something more unsettling. Apocryphal accounts suggest the Sultan had a black notebook where night after night he recorded the names of the women who disappeared. He never questioned, never confronted, only wrote, as if by naming the silence he could rid himself of the guilt of carrying it. And so the throne was split between two powers, one visible, the other whispered. The first erected statues, the second tore out tongues. The empire prospered. The people cheered, but at the heart of the palace, between tapestries and jasmine, reigned the cruelest of pacts, to pretend not to hear, when everyone had already stopped speaking. During a quiet restoration in the basement of the old Topkapi Palace, Turkish archaeologists found more than gold-embroidered fabrics. They uncovered a secret that had survived oblivion. Hand-stitched with almost invisible thread and tiny handwriting, a poetic verse lay hidden in the inner lining of a ceremonial veil. There was no clear signature, but the pain was unmistakable. She sang with her eyes, because her lips were already silence. The words were written like a whisper trapped in the threads of the fabric, a lament sown in fear. At first, scholars believed it to be an artistic embellishment, a typical Ottoman detail. But the more they investigated, the more they understood. This was a testament. The veil belonged to one of the concubines who disappeared from the 17th century records. Her name does not appear in the genealogies. No portrait remains. But her final act, turning pain into poetry, broke the silence the queen so carefully cultivated. The handwriting was precise, delicate, but firm, as if each letter had been embroidered with purpose. To resist. The concubine who wrote that verse not only anticipated her own punishment, she silently defied the notion that all pain could be erased. This small poem caused an uproar among Ottoman historians. For the first time, there was something personal, intimate, and at the same time incredibly political, coming from inside the harem. It wasn't a decree, nor a male report. It was a woman's voice, stitched into fabric, slipping through the fingers of time. The existence of the poem also revealed another layer of horror. Many of the Queen's victims weren't just eliminated. They were silenced, even before they could be forgotten. The absence of screams wasn't mercy. It was method. But this woman, even stripped of her voice, managed to sing, not with her mouth but with her needle, not with sound but with hidden words, as if embroidery were a scream sewn between seams. Subsequent investigations uncovered other similar symbols in cloaks, handkerchiefs, even in the linings of cushions used in the women's quarters. Tiny letters, crossed stitches, ambiguous shapes that are now seen differently. They weren't just decorations, they were codes. It's known that the poem was dated around 1654, a time when silent transfers of concubines increased drastically. This supports the theory that even when the world went quiet, some women found ways to speak the truth. Truth did not shout. It whispered, and that's why it survived. Today, that piece of veil is preserved under glass, displayed only during restricted exhibitions. Some visitors report getting chills when they look at it. Others cry without knowing exactly why. Perhaps because, when faced with that delicately embroidered line, everyone hears for the first time a woman who was taught never to speak again. The silence she imposed outlived her death. There was no celebration when the Queen fell, no cries for justice. The harem simply exhaled, slowly, like one who fears the air might still carry the poison of memory. The curtains were replaced, the halls were scrubbed, but the fear remained. For years, perhaps decades, no concubine dared to sing, even when permitted. Experienced maids lowered their eyes at the mention of the word tongue, and eunuchs pretended not to remember the secret passages where once nameless orders were carried. The new queen, or rather the woman who took the title after the fall of the one who cut mouths, banned any mention of the past. But what isn't spoken becomes a whisper, and a whisper, in time, becomes a warning. In villages around Istanbul, fear took another form. Mothers taught their daughters that words could turn into blades. It was a form of protection, but also inherited submission. Popular belief held that some women, when they spoke too much, bled from the mouth at night. It was superstition, of course, or maybe not. The terror planted didn't stop at the palace. It spread into homes, embroidery schools, folk songs sung in a minor key, songs that ended abruptly, as if someone, somewhere in history, had forgotten the ending, or simply remained silent forever. Even centuries later, scholars report that in the manuscripts of female poetry from the Ottoman Empire, there is a disturbing pattern. Many authors never signed their verses, not out of modesty but out of fear, as if every woman who dared to give voice to her pain could, at any moment, be accused of wanting more than she should. The Queen's name was erased from official records, but her shadow was imprinted on the culture. No one mentioned her in the archives, yet everyone knew her legend. She was called the one who silenced, the purifier, the one who tore out. Titles that don't appear in historical annals, but remain alive in stories told by candlelight. And so, even after death, she continued to reign, not with jewels or decrees, but with fear, a fear that shaped behaviors, gestures, restrained smiles. That taught women to avoid direct eye contact, to weigh every word, a fear that no longer needed executioners, because it had already taken root in the bones. Perhaps that was her greatest victory, turning silence into inheritance, and making her own name, even forgotten, an eternal warning. Unlike other queens who were honored with mosaics, poems, and biographies, her name was erased with care. Scribes crossed out parchments, palace chronicles were re-edited, and the few statues that remained lost their plaques. Everything that could remind was carefully silenced. But there are absences that scream louder than words. In museums in Istanbul, an old painting shows a woman with an impenetrable gaze seated beside the Sultan. No caption, no mention, only the emptiness where her name should be. Visitors pass by in a hurry, but some curators still whisper, "That was her, the silent one." In the halls of the old harem, the room said to have been hers remains closed to visitors. Officially due to restoration, unofficially due to superstition. Servants claim the place holds a permanent chill even on the hottest days of the Turkish summer. And at certain moments they say they hear footsteps, but no whispers, as if the silence there had become a living entity. Modern historians face a dilemma: how to tell the story of someone who was erased by the very power she wielded, how to prove the Queen existed if the empire went out of its way to bury her without a trace. It is in this void that legends arise, and it is they who keep the memory alive, distorted, yes, but alive. Oral traditions, especially in the countryside, still tell of a queen who ordered silence before death. Children are warned with stories where the voice becomes a curse. And older women avoid uttering names that do not appear in books, but remain etched in the skin of collective memory. Mourning, like everything in that reign, was also silenced. No public funeral, no official rite, just a sudden disappearance. And the order that no one asked, because even grief for her was forbidden. And so, the queen who turned love into a sentence and silence into punishment was herself condemned to oblivion. But forced forgetting is an illusion, because every time a woman stays silent out of fear, or a name is intentionally left out, she returns, not as an honored memory, but as a specter, the living proof that power, when corrupted by paranoia, doesn't need a voice to keep ruling. If this story disturbed you, imagine how many others still remain hidden, smothered not for lack of evidence, but for excess of fear. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and share this video. And don't miss the next one, because some truths only appear when history is told out loud.